to take place in the flesh earlier this year, but COVID-19 got in the way of that, as many other things. Hopefully we'll be able to have a socially distanced conference next year, but in the meantime, it's great to see everyone online. We today will be marking Anti-Corruption Day by talking about joining efforts against the democracy killers, corruption, money laundering, and propaganda, which are obviously all three linked phenomena connected to kleptocracy and the efforts of some governments to prevent their citizens from enjoying equal rights and freedoms. Attendees, please feel free to drop any questions you have in the Q&A box, and we'll try and keep on top of them as we go along, and also answer any that are left over at the end. All the panelists are going to speak for about 5 minutes or so, with hopefully a little bit of give and take and back and forth, and so we'll all wrap up in about an hour and a half or so. So to introduce our panelists, they're going to be speaking in this order. First up will be George Kent, career diplomat who has worked at the State Department since 1992 and who just showed us a really excellent cushion. He's a specialist in Russia and Ukrainian issues, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. He was Deputy Chief of Mission in Kiev from 2015 to 2018. Next will be Anastasia Radina, who is chair of the Anti-Corruption Committee at the Verkhovna Rada in Kiev, from the Sluha Narodu Party. Sorry about my Ukrainian pronunciation. I keep thinking it's Russian. Then Ambassador Matti Maasikas, the EU ambassador in Kiev, career diplomat from Estonia, who has served in senior positions in Tallinn, Helsinki, and Brussels. Then will be Yevhen Fedchenko, director of the School of Journalism at the National University in Kiev. He has contributed to many major international news organizations and is editor of Stop Fake, which aims to raise media literacy in Ukraine and to combat the spread of misinformation, and has been doing amazing work for the last 6 years. And then Paul Massaro, policy advisor at the US Helsinki Commission, the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, whose expertise is in issues like corruption, sanctions, and energy security. And last, but very much not least, will be Daria Kaleniuk, co-founder, executive director of the Anti-Corruption Action Center in Kiev, which she has run, or co-run, along with Vitaly since 2013. So that should take us about an hour, and then hopefully there'll be lots of time for questions at the end. So George, if you'd like to kick us off and give us your take on the theme, and very much look forward to hearing from everybody.
Thanks, Oliver. It's an honor to join this distinguished group of panelists on International Anti-Corruption Day to discuss one of the more enduring challenges facing all of Eastern Europe, containing corruption, and we can talk about that zero corruption versus containing element, as part of the broader effort to counter malign influence and build systemic integrity to help a country and its people succeed on their own terms in control of their own destiny. Corruption kills, whether that's stealing from soldiers and armies on the front lines who are fighting external aggression, in the provinces, fighting the theft of resources, as Katya Handjuk found out in Kherson, or creating a resilient national public health system able to meet the challenges posed by pandemics like COVID. Corruption and disinformation also sap the legitimacy of freely elected governments and undermine trust in institutions. That, in turn, limits economic prosperity and investment that creates jobs at home, driving citizens to seek work abroad. Experience over the last 3 decades in the region shows that anti-corruption efforts succeed most often through a triangle dynamic of civil society activists, public servants and institutions of integrity committed to helping the country advance, and then international partners supporting both. While panels like these often highlight the first and third elements, because that's who we are, the middle one, representing political will of those in office, executive, legislative, and judicial, is often the most decisive factor to ensuring enduring success. At the heart of this discussion is the implicit social contract between citizens and those in power, along with the mechanisms that citizens have and countries have to ensure their voices are heard and to hold office holders to account. In Moldova, voters just elected as president Maia Sandu, who has made honesty and integrity her calling cards over a corrupt pro-Russian incumbent. In Belarus, a country generally noted for lower levels of corruption, voters decided that the implicit social contract over the past 25 years no longer held and voted for change, first at the ballot box in August, and then when that vote was falsified with their feet on the streets. As for Ukraine, it's no secret that oligarchic and pro-Russian vested interests have played a leading role in undermining sorely needed reforms in handicapping the works of Ukraine's democratic and rule of law institutions. Those corrupt actors have repeatedly attacked reformers and civil society activists, as well as international partners, and worked to unravel hardwell reforms. I know other panelists will get into those details, starting with Anastasia after I go. What can the United States do to help anti-corruption action and reform in countries like Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, Georgia, and Armenia? First, starting at home, we can deny the use of our own banking system, economic assets, and corporate registries to corrupt actors who may not be held to account in their own countries. I expect Paul later on will describe recent hopeful developments on this front and a key congressional bill being finalized at President. And hopefully we may be able to shut down the issues of shell companies and clarifying who the beneficial owners are of US corporations. Second, our law enforcement can go after corrupt actors. If someone breaks a law in the United States, regardless of where they are, there's a reason and a basis for us to prosecute. The United States jailed former Ukrainian Prime Minister Lazarenko for a decade for what at the time was the biggest ever money laundering case in the United States. US officials indicted pro-Russian gas oligarch Dmitry Firtash, who's been fighting extradition from Vienna, Austria for the last 5 years. And earlier this year, the Department of Justice seized properties through civil forfeiture owned by oligarch Kolomoisky, and the FBI raided Kolomoisky-affiliated businesses in Cleveland and Miami. The United States can also publicly designate and sanction individuals, as we did to corrupt Moldovan oligarch Kaleniuk earlier this year, using special authorities. Working with partner countries, the US and other Western countries can support the building of capacity, integrity, and resilience in government institutions and in civil society. We do so by partnering with international organizations who have centers of expertise, such as the OSCE in Paris, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the UN-affiliated International Development Law Organization, IDLO, based in Rome, and the Council of Europe's Venice Commission, which probably has good name recognition in Ukraine. We also work with willing governments to reform existing structures, such as prosecutors' offices, to modernize legislation, such as criminal codes, and to build new organizations with integrity. And in Ukraine's case, over the last 6 years, that has included the Patrol Police, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, or NABU, as an investigative body, the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor, or SOP, and the High Anti-Corruption Court. We can also refuse to work with corrupt individuals and institutions to avoid lending them legitimacy. And finally, and perhaps equally as important, we can support those in civil society to take risks, to seek to hold those in power to account, and to counter disinformation with the truth. And with that, I turn the conversation over to Anastasia.
Thank you very much. First of all, it's my pleasure to be part of this distinguished panel as well. Secondly, I have to say that I agree with Mr. Ken to the point that I literally thought you somehow got hold of some of my talking points. I very much share the perspective that anti-corruption fight in Ukraine is right now a fight for not just Ukraine's, but the whole region's geopolitical choice. Why am I saying that? Because if, or I would prefer to say when, Ukraine succeeds with anti-corruption reform and rule of law reform, this success story will have a power to create domino effect in the whole region and help other neighboring countries to cope with the path of rule of law and anti-corruption reform. However, if it happens, so I hope it never happens, but still, if Ukraine fails, it's difficult for me even to imagine that and to make myself say that aloud, but unfortunately, if it happens so that Ukraine fails in anti-corruption reform, in reform of the rule of law, this will question not only pro-European choice of Ukrainian people, this was also question Ukraine's cooperation with the civilized world, if I may put it like this, financial and other assistance, and will leave Ukraine one-to-one with Russia as a failed state, which it seems something Russia would want to see in Ukraine. This is why probably for the first time in Ukrainian history, we are seeing not just corrupt officials fighting back anti-corruption reform, but corrupt officials and corrupt oligarchs basically merging and uniting efforts with pro-Russian forces in order to undermine anti-corruption reform, in order to undermine the rule of law, and through that to undermine Ukraine's cooperation with the Western world, chances for Ukraine's European integration, and basically the European choice of Ukrainian people. This is why we are seeing efforts of pro-Russian politicians to basically by undermining anti-corruption legislation through decisions of the Constitutional Court and through questionable legislation in the parliament. I think many of you do know that just recently Constitutional Court of Ukraine has taken an may I say outrageous decision that produced grave damage to the whole recently created anti-corruption infrastructure. Not just the Constitutional Court proclaimed key elements of anti-corruption reform unconstitutional, it also literally created a situation of amnesty for all public officials who might have had some, let's say, dirty issues in their asset declarations. At the same time, what the Constitutional Court did, it acted in the conflict of interest, took decision in its own interest, and basically undermined the small trust Ukrainians still have in public institutions. Positive, I would say, side effect of that, yes, there is positive side effect to that, is that pro-reform and pro-Western, pro-civilized world, I would prefer to say, forces in the parliament and in political elites are uniting together in order to fight back. This fighting back will not be easy. In some points we will win, in some points we will lose. Of course, we can see that pro-Russian and pro-oligarch, pro-all the corrupt people forces are also fighting back, while we are trying to re-establish anti-corruption legislation, to reintroduce meaningful sanctions for corruption-related offenses. Pro-Russian forces in the parliament basically try to water down this legislative efforts and make new anti-corruption legislation and infrastructure as, so to say, tasteless as possible. I probably have to say that although our efforts are, our pro-reform oriented people efforts are quite united and quite strong, it seems we will be needing support from international community. And when I say support, I probably mean the kind of influence which works best with corrupt people and their enablers than probably pages of politically correct communiques. What I mean by that is personal sanctions. Personal sanctions to at least a group of most, let's say, distinguished supporters of pro-Russian and pro-oligarch forces can do miracles, can achieve something, again, hours of diplomatic communication will never do, and that is pass a clear message that supporting those who would like to undermine anti-corruption reform and rule of law reform in Ukraine is a matter of, let's say, personal insecurity. Therefore, just to wrap up, I would kindly ask international community, or welcome international community in efforts to adopt legislation like the Magnitsky law in the US and then in the EU, and may say not to be very shy in attempts to apply this legislation properly. That's probably it. Thank you.
Thank you, Anastasia. Can I ask, obviously directly after the revolution in 2014, there was a lot of Western support for Ukrainian reformers. Do you think there's still the same degree of support? Is there still the same degree of interest, or are people, losing focus and looking at other?
There's still a huge degree of support. However, the kinds of the same leverage, of course, cannot be equally effective in 2014 and in 6 years after that in 2020. This is why, again, I'm talking not that much about the leverage of financial assistance, but the leverage of personal sanctions and prosecuting, if I may say so, not only corrupt officials directly, but also members of their families and also enablers, all the lawyers and other people they are using in Western countries in order to push politically for their interests.
Thank you. If we on to Ambassador Maasikas, who I think has joined us as a representative of one of those main Western friends of Ukraine. I wondered if you could give us your assessment for this Anti-Corruption Day.
Thank you very much, Oliver, colleagues and friends. Really good to be in this panel, in this event. The EU practices at home what it preaches abroad. Be it in the areas like climate change, where we are at the forefront of fulfilling the Paris commitments, but it's also in the most important fight against corruption and for the rule of law with our partners. At home, the EU has over the last 6-7 years developed a whole new set of instruments and forms of cooperation, starting with the rule of law dialogue among member states, then the EU treaties Article 7 were invoked against some member states. Then since this year, a yearly rule of law reports on all member states have been adopted by the European Commission and discussed among member states, and the EU funds used by member states will be tied to also will be linked with the rule of law conditionality. The discussions are still ongoing, but I am certain that an agreement will be found here. Add to that the stepped up cooperation on money laundering and fighting disinformation, also important in our cooperation with Ukraine as well. Now, for Ukraine, I mean, I was there in 2014 in Brussels, representing Estonia in the EU, and I witnessed and acted on how the massive support by the EU was formed. First of all, to support Ukraine against the acts of aggression by Russia, and almost as importantly, in Ukraine's efforts to fight corruption. Because, I mean, for us, and for me personally, I don't hide that, the revolution of dignity 2013-2014 was about Ukrainian society having emancipated to the point that they were, Ukrainian people, Ukrainian society will no longer tolerate a corrupt regime. They overthrow it. And that's the clearest of signals, the clearest of signs, and that also enabled and enables the support by international partners. So this is a mutual commitment by the Ukrainian side and by the international partners. It's best put in the way as the previous president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, famously said, the more Ukraine reforms, the more we support Ukraine. The latest sign of this being today disbursement of 600 million macro-financial assistance to Ukraine by the European Commission. It's COVID related. It's to help Ukraine to mitigate the socio-economic effects of the pandemic, and it's not linked, and it's not a position on any other events, decisions by Ukrainians, and in any other area of our cooperation. Where we are indeed facing challenges, Anastasia touched upon them previously already. Some recent decisions by the Constitutional Court of Ukraine have really put the question mark on some most important achievements, and in a situation where it's not clear for me whether the court has fully acted on all the constitutional values of Ukraine, like the value of the Euro-Atlantic integration and the membership in the EU and NATO. But that has, the court's decisions and some consequent political developments have really made you asking: is the anti-corruption architecture really solid? Are we beyond the point of no return in our work? Can this be turned back? And I find myself in a sometimes in a bit an awkward position for a diplomat. Diplomacy is mainly about interaction between governments, between officials. But sometimes recently, when I talk to Ukrainian politicians, I, as a foreign diplomat, have to refer to the will and determination and the position of the Ukrainian people. And that's a situation that I would rather not want to be. The European Union made clear its position on the law that was adopted last Friday by the Verkhovna Rada in aiming to restore the asset declaration system. We recognize that this is a step in coping with the Constitutional Court's decisions, but that it falls short in restoring a real working and deterrent system of asset declarations. So our position is that this law needs to be improved and strengthened. The EU is clear in this, and the EU's support to the fight against corruption is rock solid in Ukraine. Both political assistance with our flagship projects like the EU Anti-Corruption Initiative and others. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Just a quick follow-up. You mentioned that it was important to reflect the will of the Ukrainian people in fighting corruption. Do you think that the patience of the European people is bottomless with Ukrainian politicians? I mean, is it possible to imagine a time when European people might just say, get fed up with this and go and look for friends elsewhere? Or do you think Ukraine's okay like that?
We're in spending the EU's money, each and every cent of it, we are spending European taxpayers' money. And we must be aware of it, and we are aware of it. And yes, sometimes we are being asked by our stakeholders, by the member states back in Brussels, is our money well spent? So far, we have been able to respond with clear conscience. Yes, the determination is there, and our cooperation on, say, improving that law that was adopted is already ongoing. So, yes.
So, Yevhen, would you like to tell us a little about disinformation and the extra enemy of democracy that we talked about at the beginning?
Yeah, thank you very much, Oliver, for this opportunity to talk. I'm quite new to anti-corruption topic, but I'm from academia, so I will try to adjust very quickly to new terminology. So speaking of disinformation and how disinformation and corruption are undermining democracy, here we've been working, as you said, for 6 years, monitoring and mapping those disinformation efforts. And what are the main objectives of disinformation to undermine democracy? So first of all, they want to bring the corrosion of values. They want to emphasize that Ukrainian society is very tired of reforms because they don't see results of them. So they want to bring more apathy to that, and they want to bring more rejection of it as a result of activities of disinformation. So from this point of view, disinformation and corruption are very connected because they feed each other. And basically they help to prove one very important thing, that Ukraine is a failed state. And this message works both for domestic Ukrainian internal audience and also for external audience, that you would rather give up with Ukraine because you don't see any results and you just cannot do that endlessly. And this corrosion of vision and corrosion of perception is basically achieved through three main instruments. Instrument number one is hybridity of instruments which are used. And from this point of view, disinformation doesn't have any limitations what they can use to undermine democracy in Ukraine. The second important issue is inflation of meanings, because very important, we talk about the same from very different perspective, and we see the same things from very different angles. Here I would like to quote former Canadian ambassador to Ukraine, Roman Vasyuk, who said that Ukrainians would never be happy with 80% of effectiveness of reforms. They would rather like to have 150% of effectiveness. And this is probably not the way, because it really depends on who is interpreting and how this interpretation is done. And that's why sometimes this crisis of interpretation leads to feed more things to propaganda, because they're really very happy to pick up on any things where we are saying, oh, we didn't achieve completely that, or we didn't achieve completely this. And they really are happy to develop those things into very stable narratives which are promoted. And also speaking of this crisis of interpretation, one another angle of this is we are living in a time, probably it's kind of a truistic thing, but I would just repeat that. We are living in a time when it isn't important who is doing what. What is important, who is doing the evaluation of that, interpretation of that, and who amplifies what was done. So on one hand, you can achieve absolutely brilliant things, but if you don't have enough capacity to communicate that to different parts of society, that would totally sound like a failure, because if you don't communicate reforms enough, people would believe that reforms failed. And here I will give you just one example. I've been following this information for years, and it does not bring a lot of happiness to be deeply involved with that, but at least it gives you a lot of insights. And I looked into how they can interpret, for example, Roman Vasyuk brilliant analysis of Ukrainian reform. And they wrote that, yeah, Ukraine was doing reforms for 6 years, but where are the results? They created 6 agencies to fight corruption, but no one went to jail. So that's a kind of, as soon as you create agencies, it immediately need to bring you to someone sitting in jail. And so this is very kind of too simplified vision of reforms. And you find that not only with corruption reforms, but with any types of reforms. So if we talk about healthcare reforms, so they're promoting the narrative that because of Dr. Suprun activities, Ukraine is suffering from COVID. And then when you say, but wait, stop, in countries, but they are still having COVID. So this is kind of this weird argument they're using. And for some people, it still plays absolutely okay, because this is very kind of simplistic, a very linear approach how to interpret reform and effectiveness of reform. And the same you can find with any other part of Ukrainian reforms. With energy sector, they promote all the time for last 6 years that Ukrainian nuclear energy is failing, and we're expecting the next Chernobyl, because Ukraine is not more reliant on the Russian sources, but is working with Westinghouse, for example. Or they're promoting the narratives that Ukrainian science and aviation and space industry failed. Why? Because we don't cooperate with Russia anymore. And those things are very, very heavily promoted, and they are very, very heavily amplified. And among that noise, sometimes it's really very, very difficult to promote the real achievements, the real outputs, and the real outcomes. Even if we know that they are there, nobody wants to listen to that. So from my point of view as communicator, sometimes it's also a communication failure, and we need to promote more. But also it's a problem of building resilience inside Ukraine to be more resilient against those disinformation narratives, and also to believe more in the necessity of reforms and achievements of those reforms. So probably I would stop here, but would be happy to answer your questions later.
Yevhen, quickly, while you're on this subject, could you let us know what are the best media sources that we outside Ukraine should be following to get a true picture of what's happening with reforms? It can be a little bit difficult for foreigners to understand what's happening for precisely the reasons that you've identified.
Yeah, actually, it's quite a tricky question, because if we talk about the values journalists are usually looking, very often they are looking for failures, not success, because success doesn't make a great news story. That's a problem, but that's how journalism is organized. And that's why you would not find too many stories about success of Ukraine, because then someone would say, oh, this is kind of promoted content, who paid for this to promote around, because actually nobody is interested in a genuine success stories which are around. And that's why, for example, happy to follow one very unknown small Ukrainian blog in Ukrainian, which is called What Is There, because they promote these little small stories of little successes of Ukrainians everywhere. So it's not about kind of big issues, big policies, but that's kind of everyday achievements of people, and that's what media are not covering. And that's actually what people probably want to know more and to read more. And that's, again, directly connected to disinformation, because if you have the vacuum of something, you would immediately find that someone is using that vacuum to promote very different narratives. If Ukrainians, if ourselves, if we do not believe in other people would do believe in what we are doing. So this is kind of the initial question, and that's why probably we need to promote those small success stories. Of course, it always comes with inefficiency and failures and other things, which we still would find around. And of course, we should not say that, well, it was a kind of success story and everybody need to be proud of. But again, repeating kind of analysis of Ambassador Washuk, who said that, yeah, but Ukrainians did have a lot of things done right. And those underachievements should not kind of downside all those achievements. So it's kind of always looking for balance between those two types of stories. But sometimes I think it's unbalanced, and people might be kind of disheartened and disbelieving in what is happening here.
Thank you very much. So, Paul, talking of good news, I'm hoping that you're going to share some excellent news from the Hill, and also the general picture of what's happening.
Yes, that's right. And thanks so much, Oliver. And thank you very much to all the panelists, and especially Dr. Fedchenko there, because I get to follow you up and talk about some success stories. And I think you made some excellent points. I mean, when the good things happen, you really need to kind of toot the horn of what's going on and really get it out there, because people need to know, they need to know that kleptocracy isn't forever and that we can actually fight back, and we can fight back successfully. So I think that that's kind of my message today, is that we are in this incredible circumstance of just these huge, unprecedented anti-kleptocracy accomplishments coming out of Congress, unexpectedly, really, and it's quite exciting. And we're seeing maybe even the outline of a new American grand strategy that would see domestic and foreign policy built around fighting corruption, both domestically and globally, against fighting kleptocracy. In fact, we saw recently, I'm sure all of us here read this profile of the incoming National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. This extremely high-ranking individual who will have the presidency, or the incoming presidency, who said that this is, one of his loftiest goals, that this is a really serious foreign policy problem, and something we want to take on. There are others that have talked about this that are clearly close to the incoming administration, such as Dr. Michael Carpenter, who actually wrote an op-ed with the president-elect a couple years ago. So it's a very exciting time. And then, beside all of that, we have real concrete action now from Congress. So I am personally very excited, and I actually think that even though we have all these accomplishments now, sky's the limit. There's so much more that can be done. And when you actually achieve something that people start feeling comfortable with and feel like they can work together on, then you start seeing a lot more action coming. So I think that coming down the line, we'll see more of this. So that's why I want to sort of talk about three main pillars here. Pillar one, sort of what has been done, what have we accomplished this Congress. Pillar two, looking at what Congress can do and needs to do. And then pillar three, looking at what we might expect from the incoming administration, plus sort of what Congress might expect and Congress's congressional oversight role. So first off, I want to talk about a piece of Helsinki legislation, before I get into kind of what everybody's expecting in the NDAA, a piece of Helsinki legislation that was just signed into law last Friday, the Chenkov Anti-Doping Act, which attacks corruption in international sport competitions. It redefines doping as fraud against athletes, fraud against companies, fraud against states, and it actually makes it illegal in these international competitions and establishes U.S. extraterritorial jurisdiction over it. So it's a really exciting law, essentially an FCPA for sport. So it's one of these really neat kind of new approaches. And we've seen laws like this have a lot of success before, like the FCPA, and hopefully we're going to see really aggressive enforcement of that. And we actually saw that with, we saw something similar to that with DOJ's enforcement of criminal law against FIFA over the last 5 years. All right. So moving on to the National Defense Authorization Act, which I'm sure is what everybody wants to hear about. The top line item in this massive omnibus, thousands of pages bill for everybody here is incorporation transparency. Now the NDAA has just been approved by the House. It must still be approved by the Senate later this week and then signed by the President. It was approved with a veto-proof majority. This beneficial ownership legislation is very strong. It's exactly what the community was looking for. It is not public, which I know is something that a lot of the international community had hoped for. But it is not public. It is accessible to law enforcement. But it really is the first of its kind in the USA. Anybody on this particular, anybody interested in these things and this tuning into this event knows that US shell companies have been a really, really serious problem. So this essentially does away with those in a really dramatic way. And it's extremely exciting, going from 0 beneficial ownership registries in the USA to 1 for all the states. Is quite an accomplishment. So hopefully that will be law before the year is out. It's looking extremely likely. In the NDAA, there is also, I want to flag a few other things that perhaps people here have paid a bit less attention to. The Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Rewards Act actually creates a whistleblower program for kleptocracy. That is to say that if you know assets that have been stolen and hidden in the USA, and the US law enforcement is able to recover them, then we will do a payout of those recovered assets to the individual that revealed that. So let's say some penthouse in New York City or something is recovered, DOJ recovers it. It was bought with stolen money, maybe even stolen in Ukraine, and it's recovered, and then they sell that penthouse and are able to turn it into, I don't know, $100 million or whatever. Some percentage of that can go to the whistleblower. So we want to see whistleblowers step forward. Whistleblowers are, of course, the way, essentially, that a lot of these cases get created. So many are so complex and so convoluted and so opaque that you really need whistleblowers. So that's very, very exciting. And then finally, I could spend the entire call talking about some of the incredible AML reforms that have come down the line as part of what's called the Counter Act. But that was also put in the bill. If you look at the 2 pages that essentially are the AML section, you'll see like beneficial ownership's only 3 sections, and there's like 30 other sections, right? And many of these are the Counter Act sections which reinforce public-private sharing information, enable, kind of technical but very cool things like being able to subpoena a domestic bank for records from foreign subsidiaries, which, wasn't possible before and really stymied investigations, bringing antiquities dealers under AML obligations, and then like just a ton of really fascinating studies on Russian money laundering, Chinese state money laundering, trade-based money laundering, authoritarian influence via money laundering. So I mean, this bill is just really fantastic. And for risk of taking up the next 15 minutes, just delving so deeply into it, I'll go ahead and move on to pillar 2 here, and that is what is ahead. So with this incredible bipartisan foundation to work off of, where Republicans and Democrats have so unanimously said kleptocracy is bad and is anti-American and is something that we need to work against together. What can we do with that? And there are tons of things. I think first I'll flag a few things that, Oliver flagged in one of his recent oligarchy newsletters, which everybody should sign up for if you're not signed up for it yet. But first and foremost for me, and something that I feel very passionately about, is golden visas. And of course, the EU is struggling with this issue as well. And so are we. Our EB5 visa program, provides the ability to receive an American visa and then also a pathway to citizenship for, I think now it's gone from $500,000 to $1 million, but for a kleptocrat, of course, is a drop in the bucket. So this is something we're looking at how, if we cannot abolish these programs, how at the very least are we able to share information with one another to prevent visa shopping and to ensure that these visas don't go to kleptocrats. And that's something that some of the measures could be done by the executive branch, but if you wanted to make dramatic changes to this, it need to be done through Congress. Then, of course, there's the question of trusts and foundations, the other major money laundering vehicles. Those changes would also need to occur through congressional action. So moving to some other initiatives that I find very important. One of the ones is based off a Helsinki bill introduced this year, and that is criminalizing the demand side of foreign bribery. So of course, the FCPA makes it illegal for a US company to pay a bribe abroad, but it is not illegal for a foreign official to demand a bribe to extort a US company or listed entity. Most foreign bribery laws include this provision, although cases are often not pursued against these individuals, but the US law does not. The DOJ has often tried to pursue these cases under anti-money laundering laws, criminal anti-money laundering laws, but if you were able to give this explicit authority, you'd really empower DOJ to start bringing big cases against these foreign officials. And I think of just a whole host of recent cases in the region that could do that. Hungary, for example, there's an ongoing case, FCPA case that's been revealed. Is a Microsoft sort of thing. But of course, foreign officials extorted those bribes at some point too. There's always two sides to bribery, and you really need to go after both sides. Another big thing is to be able to provide the authority to use fines and penalties from this incredible supply side law, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which generates hundreds of millions of dollars in fines and penalties against these companies that engage in corruption, because the United States does not export corruption, a year, and then to funnel these back into global anti-corruption work so that we can finally resource this to the extent that it should be resourced. And this is essentially our initiative here is the Crook Act, the Countering Russian and Other Overseas Kleptocracy Act, which we'll reintroduce next year. We're just working now on getting that mechanism right and working out all the kinks in that mechanism. We also want to retool foreign aid. That's going to take congressional action to ensure that it's fighting kleptocracy, that it's not inadvertently supporting kleptocracy as it is very sadly done in the past, especially security assistance being provided to dictatorships. And then finally, Congress will have some role in providing anti-money laundering obligations for professional services, like lawyers, real estate professionals, stuff like that, and gatekeepers. Now, a lot of these have already been provided, a lot of these authorities, but some have yet to be provided. And then, of course, like real estate professionals, Congress provided the authority in 2001 under the Patriot Act, and it has still not been implemented. So I think that brings me to my final pillar that I want to talk about. And this is kind of, action to be expected out of the incoming administration, plus stuff that, we'll want to keep a very close eye on, and we can expect congressional engagement on, if not congressional legislation, is implementation of the beneficial ownership registry, which is going to be gigantic. This is a huge thing. The UK is obviously a great example of a country that's working to get, still working, years after to get theirs to the point that people can say, yes, this is great. We'll be just getting started, and we'll be looking as to how to do this and privately, as opposed to the UK's public registry. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of work there to ensure that it gets done right, it's useful, it's meaningful, and that it's set up quickly, that it's set up in time to affect a lot of these cases. The second thing, like I'd mentioned on anti-money laundering obligations, is we need rules-making processes to go on for all sorts of professional services. This would be in some sense an expansion of what's called geographic targeting orders in the United States for real estate, which puts an anti-money laundering obligation on title insurance, who collect beneficial ownership information for those making real estate purchases. But it's all this sort of stuff, who files SARs, who does customer due diligence and stuff like that. I want to emphasize also something that George said on targeted sanctions authorities are still just going to be so important. We should double down, triple down, quadruple down on this stuff. Global Magnitsky, 7031C, which state has done an amazing job implementing, and of course we'd want to see so much more of that. You can't have enough public visa bans. Naming and shaming is just so important. And we actually have legislation out there that would amend the underlying statute, the Immigration and Nationality Act. It's called the Kleptocratic Exposure Act, which would enable state to just reveal the name of anyone whose visa is banned for reason of kleptocracy. And this naming and shaming stuff is just so important. Two more things. International law enforcement cooperation is extremely important through this. Even when we have extraterritorial jurisdiction, it's not like American cops can go abroad and arrest someone. You still need to work with and work within the law of other countries. And for this, we need really strong MLATs, mutual legal assistance treaties, take another look at those. And we need to retake Interpol. Interpol has sadly been, become a vector of authoritarian abuse to go after, political dissidents. And we need to use it. We need to retake it, make it democratic, and use it to fight corruption. And then finally, there's the whole asset recovery discussion. It's very important, returning assets to those from whom they're stolen, but we also need to make very sure that they are not returned to those who stole them. And again, here's a place where we have some legislation out there, a bill called the Justice for Victims of Kleptocracy Act, which would require that DOJ put on a publicly accessible website money, assets that have been recovered by the United States from whom they've been stolen, from which people they've been stolen from the Ukrainian people, stolen from the Venezuelan people, and recovered by the United States, and express our intention to return, our intention, and our obligation under the UN Convention Against Corruption. But we have to understand that we can't do it if they're going to be stolen again. So I'll stop there. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Paul. Before we go on to Daria, just one very quick question. I think the NDAA is potentially, as you say, an absolute game changer of the most amazing kind. I've been withholding my enthusiasm just in case it gets vetoed. When you say veto-proof majority, does that mean it's good or not yet?
It's not good, not yet.
Okay.
It's veto-proof because it's over 2/3. You need 2/3 of each House of Congress to override a veto. But if it were vetoed, it would still have to be overridden. It's not like it's automatically overridden because it's over 2/3. So yeah, if it were to be vetoed, it would still have to be overridden by both houses of Congress.
So we can't take it to the bank quite yet.
Not quite yet. Yes, it's like what is it? The stock hasn't matured quite yet. It's like in a week. You know, you don't want the company to tank in that time, right?
Oh, I get impatient. Okay, thanks very much, Daria. It is now your turn to fill us in on your end of the business.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, Paul, and congratulations with good news in the Congress. So we do hope that the new beneficial ownership law will work. And Anastasia was explaining us how the one decision of the Constitutional Court destroyed significant part of the anti-corruption infrastructure in Ukraine. This is actually the reform. We worked with many good players in Ukraine for 6 years. But then 10 judges gathered together and for no reason decided that, okay, we want to destroy the system of asset declarations. But then when we look into the asset declarations of the judges of the Constitutional Court in Ukraine, we see a Delaware company. You know, the head of the Constitutional Court of Ukraine declared that his wife has a Delaware company. And then we digged into his wife, okay, what this wife was doing. There is no legitimate reason for her to have business. So she doesn't look like a businesswoman, but still she, for some reason, has a Delaware company. It would be good to get more information. What is this company about? But, you know, in the US registry, you can't do that. In Ukrainian registry, you actually can go into the registry. You can see everything about the company. A beneficial owner, a former owner, shares, and this is something we lacked, and we hope that this will be an additional powerful tool to trace money of corrupt Ukrainian officials, including Constitutional Court judges, which are destroying key reforms, which are important for Ukrainian pro-Western orientation and are important for building the rule of law in Ukraine. And this is the point where everything is connected. When some policy changes in the US are connected to what is happening in Ukraine. And this is the point where we see also how disinformation and corruption and money laundering are connected and feeding each other. Yevhen told that disinformation and corruption are feeding each other, but also the third pillar of this vicious circle of this democracy killers is money laundering and the ability to move money. So when we are looking to the Ukrainian reforms, we see that actually things worked. Actually, asset declarations forced some very important, powerful players in Ukraine to disclose their real assets. Actually, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, the investigative agency, is able to investigate and hold accountable untouchable people. The High Anti-Corruption Court, the court which was set up with the support of the EU and support with the US, and where the foreign experts, including the former UK judge, had the crucial role in selecting judges, we see that this court delivers result. It is just the very different court from all other courts in Ukraine. There is justice there, and there is fairness in decision-making there. There is hope that the cases will not be bought just through the bribe to the judge. When these things are effective, then they are getting more and more oppression and more attacks from various stakeholders who want Ukraine to fail and who want Ukrainian criminal justice to fail. And these stakeholders are both inside the Ukraine and outside of Ukraine. And this is the moment in Ukraine, in this period of time, when they are actually colluding and their interests are very much the same. This is the moment when oligarch Igor Kolomoisky, who is under the investigation in the United States and Ukraine, doesn't want Ukraine to be closer to the EU, to have close relationships with IMF and with the US. Igor Kolomoisky doesn't want National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine to share information with foreign law enforcement agencies. And this is the moment when the interest of Ukrainian oligarch, one of many, is the same as the interest of our external enemy, Kremlin, and autocratic Russian system of kleptocracy. And this is the moment where propaganda and disinformation is entering the scene. And this is the moment when 4 national TV channels in Ukraine are spreading every day fakes, disinformation, and black PR against reforms and reformers in our country, against anti-corruption agencies, and spreading narratives crafted. It smells that they were crafted somewhere in Kremlin, you know, that IMF wants to enslave Ukraine, that there is this mythical group of Soros children in Ukraine, and everyone in Ukraine who wants reform is this part of this Soros big plan to attack the world, you know. And I can give you more and more narratives, but they are actually there every day on the 4 national TV channels. And then we look, okay, and I will explain now how this propaganda is colluding with money laundering. We look, okay, who is owner of these TV channels? One of the official owners is Cyprus company. Then we see, okay, what is this Cyprus company about? Where does the money come? And then we see the paths of money, of fueling money to Ukrainian propaganda, anti-Ukrainian, I would say, propaganda system through shell companies in Cyprus, through bank accounts in Belarus, through bank accounts in Russia. And we are able to actually expose that because we have asset disclosure system in Ukraine. You know, if we didn't have asset disclosure system in Ukraine, we would never be able to find out that, let's say, US sanctioned Viktor Medvedchuk, a key Putin proxy in Ukraine, actually controls 98 companies. 2 of them in Great Britain, 5 in Bulgaria, and 44 in Cyprus. And 1 in St. Nevis and you know, all these islands companies. So the person who is sanctioned by the US since 2014 is able to bypass these sanctions, simply lying to state registries across the world, saying it's not him, it's his wife who controls all these companies. And then we see that actually from asset declarations, these companies are the key source of his official income and official income of his close associates who sit in Ukrainian parliament jointly with Anastasia, actually, but who are motivated to make Ukraine a failed state. So we have to follow the money. We have to see where are these anti-Kremlin, anti-Western sources are being funded. And this is where we have to unite our efforts. By our efforts, I'm saying the efforts of civil society, the efforts of good law enforcement and law enforcers in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine. We need to joint efforts of good decision makers and to expose and to cut these channels of fueling money to support propaganda. And the propaganda is killing. It is destroying. It creates narratives and it prepares people to vote against common sense in Ukraine. And this is where the 5th national TV channel is being added, and it's Igor Kolomoisky TV channel. which is the most popular TV channel in Ukraine. And it is also spreading the same fakes and the same disinformation which the Medvedchuk TV channels are spreading. So I tried to talk not only about Ukraine. And the reason I mentioned this case of Viktor Medvedchuk TV channels and Igor Kolomoisky TV channels and their propaganda is because actually they are not possible only with having resources from inside Ukraine. We have clear path. We see that they rely a lot on Belarus. It was our eye-opening case, so it's kind of a gray zone where some kleptocrats and some dirty people are using to bypass US sanctions and to make sure that they have some money flow from Russia. What I'm also saying is sanctions are important, and I agree with Anastasia, and I'm very thankful to George and to Paul for mentioning that sanctions have to be increased, and sanctions have a powerful tool. But it's important also to enforce sanctions. There are ways to bypass sanctions, and there can be collaboration with civil society, investigative journalists, and decision makers to how to make sure that there is no way to bypass the sanctions. And I wanted to say something on the positive note. I think Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, Georgia, Armenia, and Russia are very much connected. Sometimes I want to treat these countries as one body. And probably they have to be treated as one body, even though, Russia is attacking everyone. But, if Moldova has a success story, and I'm very much, keeping fingers crossed for Maya Sandu, but if they will succeed, if Ukraine will succeed, it's a game changer for the entire region. If Belarus people will keep standing on their streets, actually risking their lives, but keep standing and keep demanding justice and dignity and rule of law, then they could join actually these game-changing countries. And we need to help each other somehow, but also we are not able with these countries to resolve the issues of corruption, money laundering, and propaganda just from inside. The players against us are using shell companies, are using access to Western financial system, are using Western PR experts and lobbyists in order to make our countries as failed states and to attack the entire idea of liberal democracy. Therefore, in order for good players, for those who are fighting for good cause, it is important to have support from outside, to have support from the US, to have support from the EU. Otherwise, I'm afraid it will be hard to protect the idea of liberal democracy in this part of the world. But I'm very much hopeful. I think that we are moving in the right direction. Disregarding that, everyone now in Ukraine, even in my team, feel pessimistic. I think that it's good that the system is being attacked. It's good that anti-corruption institutions are being attacked. It means they are effective, and it means that we are on the right direction. It means that we already understand what will work. Yes, we still need help how to protect these institutions and how to make the expansion of the reforms to the broader judicial reform and other criminal justice of reforms. But I see that that the light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daria. Thank you. That's a very inspiring way to end. We have about another 23 minutes. My clock tells me. I wanted to ask George, the the question of the geopolitical factor, the euphemistic geopolitical factor, and essentially the role of Russia in spreading corruption as a tool of external politics came up again and again. And it's difficult not to see this as a as it were, a civilized world, a West versus corrupt world standoff, the oligarchs against the rest. Inevitably, when things are framed like that, it can be mischaracterized as a sort of hawkish US foreign policy, perhaps with some of its usual hawkish European outliers like the UK against, peace-loving Russia. I'm rather caricaturing it, but you know what I mean. I'm just wondering, how is it possible to stand up to that kind of position? How is it possible to point out that this is not about the sort of, the traditional criticisms of the US or the UK, but is actually about the sort of maintenance of the rule of law? I'm just wondering if you've had any techniques that work, or any ideas that might work.
Well, I think some of the things that Paul and I said, Oliver, cleaning up our own act, the accountability should start at home, is a very important first step. The US started with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the 1970s after a big scandal, actually, that related to our relationship with Japan. And by the time I joined the Foreign Service in the 90s, for, I won't mention which European countries, but major European countries, businesses, corruption was tax deductible. A company that paid a bribe could actually deduct that from their taxes. That's not the US system. This was decades after the US would fine our companies. That generally no longer is the case. And that's been an advance in Western Europe in the last 20 years, 25 years, very welcome. So I think that's one issue. The other issue is, unfortunately, we're also dealing with human nature. No one's come back since we're under the band of zero corruption. I honestly don't think that's possible. I think it goes back to human nature. Individuals have the capacity to do both good and ill, and individuals then are weak, and there will always be in every country I think the temptation when people dangle money and opportunity for people to break the rules and seek personal gain. I think the challenge we all face is putting in those checks and balances so that when people break the law, break the rules, that they're held to account. And I think that's something each country has its sovereign right to determine its own laws. And then obviously people of goodwill, whether they're in government, whether they're in civil society, whether they're in parliaments or the media, working together to shine light and to hold people to account. And I do believe that actually countries like Russia take advantage of those weaknesses of individuals, this willingness to be corrupt, to push their national agenda, both their own national interests in a positive sense, the way they would define it, whether that's getting contracts for gas pipelines or other contracts, but also to undermine the states that they see as their opponents. Ukraine clearly is on the front line of that sort of aggression, both conventional in a military sense, but also undermining in a corrupt sense. And we've seen that the gas pipelines through Ukraine and cheap Russian gas was sort of the original sin of the Ukrainian political ruling elite in the 1990s. Ukraine has more or less moved on from that, and we see the pressure points that Russia using its gas diplomacy move in other spheres. But I think we need to be humble about our own failings, understand that we need to keep our own individuals and institutions to account, and then we can help other countries, governments, and civil society to improve their own systems. Because ultimately, I think what we're interested in is shared prosperity and peace. And again, if you take an individual country, if there isn't an accountable system of justice, both for citizens and investors, the citizens will vote with their feet and they will go work in other countries that will pay into the pension funds of those other countries like Poland. And companies, they will choose to invest elsewhere because they know if there's a dispute, because there are always contractual disputes, they need to have the chance to go into a court and have the rule of law and contracts be upheld as opposed to connections and payments to judges. Back over to the group.
Thank you very much. If I might essentially put the same question to Ambassador Maasikas, if I may. George mentioned that the US was leading in a way by cleaning up its own act, particularly with this very exciting NDAA potential and so on. I'm wondering, to what extent does the EU need to do the same? I mean, I think we could mention quite a lot of Ukraine-related scandals, whether that's money laundering going through EU banks or golden visas with various EU jurisdictions and so on. I'm just wondering to what extent the EU is aware that there's work that needs to be done at home as well. I'm aware that I'm in the UK and I'm absolutely no leg to stand on at all. But fortunately, I'm not a participant. I'm the moderator.
Thanks. Indeed. I started deliberately my introductory intervention by laying out some things that the EU does at home. And yes, on both the money laundering, much has been done recently. The banking union, since the global financial crisis, the banking union and banking cleanup of banks and exchange of information, banking information has been enhanced. This whole regime has been enhanced in a way that was unimaginable. Concrete money laundering and money laundering cases are under the magnifying glass. Yes, the EU Commission has approached some member states who are involved in golden visas or the investment schemes for passports, because for us, for the EU institutions and for member states, the EU citizenship means something. It's something real, and it should not be on sale. So yes, all these areas are those where things are being done. You can always argue for the need to do more. From the EU's institutions side, always a very thin line to walk between the EU competencies and the competencies of the member states, but we are making progress on all those issues. Thank you.
Anastasia, if we could go to you, it's obviously a very alarming alliance you have against you of obviously Russian interests, oligarchic interests, and then all the difficulties of just getting reform at the best of times. Just wondering, how are you maintaining or trying to maintain a pro-reform coalition in the Rada? Is this going well, or is there anything anyone can do to help make that happen? I mean, I'm just wondering, how well is maintaining the momentum of reform?
I have to say that a pro-reform coalition in the parliament is actually developing. May I say Ukrainians have always been good in uniting against something. So when there is a pushback from oligarchs and from Russian forces, it's always easier for us. We somehow manage to stop arguing between ourselves and unite. So I do deliberately call this a positive side effect of what we are having now. For us, it is again very important to feel the support from international community. And again, well, I will not say anything new. I will return to the issue of sanctions against those who play in the interest of oligarchs, because these sanctions not just scare people off. These sanctions also help to uncover and work against all the misinformation campaigns, disinformation campaigns that are launched not just through media challenge, which is of course very alarming and dangerous, but also through let's say face-to-face communications in the parliament. So when people see, let's say, agents of oligarchic and the Russian influences internationally recognized, then it is much easier to fight their narratives among colleagues and among decision makers.
It's been very difficult in the past to maintain EU sanctions on former Ukrainian officials, particularly from the Yanukovych regime, because of the lack of action by Ukrainian prosecutors. Do you think have things improved now in that regard? Do you think it will be better? Because obviously it's difficult to persuade EU officials of the need to have sanctions if they don't ever lead to any action in Ukraine.
We do recognize there is a homework Ukraine needs to do. Unfortunately, I'm still not very optimistic, to say the least, about the work the Prosecutor's General Office is doing. Unfortunately, I can go long and long telling how many questionable actions has been taken by the Prosecutor's General Office in the course of anti-corruption investigations by National Anti-Corruption Bureau. Unfortunately, I have to say this continues. On the other hand, I can acknowledge that despite all the, let's say, considerable efforts of the Prosecutor's General Office not to allow investigations happen, Anti-Corruption Bureau is still doing a good job. Including that in international cooperation. For example, I strongly believe that recent case against Mr. Martynenko, former member in the parliament, former member of the Parliament of Ukraine, who received a guilty verdict. This case became possible also because of effective international cooperation of National Anti-Corruption Bureau with foreign prosecutors and law enforcement. And I think this is a good example to multiply on, if I may put it like this.
Yevhen, there's an interesting question that's coming in the questions about whether it would be good to have a Ukrainian government broadcasting corporation like this BBC or the CBC. Just wondering if you could answer that quickly, or more broadly, what we need to do in order to try and help with the issues that Daria identified of very oligarch-dominated media landscape, which undermines, reforms at every turn.
Yeah, I think it's the answer to this problem. The public television and public radio, which was launched in Ukraine, is one of those small success stories, I would say, I mentioned at the beginning. Probably they still cannot compete in terms of ratings with commercial TV channels. But again, BBC was not created in one day, and it took a while for them to become a leader. So I really do believe that Ukrainian public television and public radio also would be able at some point to come to the point where they would become the stop number one for Ukrainians to get their daily information. And from my point of view, they really doing their job, and they are still defending their editorial independence quite successfully, even sometimes in a quite harsh environment, which is, for media in Ukraine, it's always harsh environment. But now we see growing pressure for them to be more in line with the rest of the coverage. But still, you can find absolutely great pieces of journalism over there. And yeah, I agree with you. This is the answer to the growing influence of commercial, or as it's sometimes called, oligarchic media, which still dominate over Ukrainian landscape. But also, the other alternative would be small grassroots media organizations, which are also growing in Ukraine. You don't need to be huge today to be heard by millions. We've seen a lot of examples from Maidan times when very, very small streamers were much more influential than big oligarchic companies. And I think it's not the matter of how huge you are, it's a matter of what are you doing. And I would give you just one small example. When I was working for TV back in 1990s, the journalists were always saying, oh, if we would have that or that great piece of hardware, we would be able to produce that and that and that. And now all Ukrainian TV channels finally acquired those great pieces of hardware, but still it did not bring the improvement of the quality of the content they produce. So it's not, or my students are saying, oh, we are so uncomfortable doing our project with small cameras. So we really need to realize that now we live in an age when the size of media and size of equipment doesn't matter much. What is the most important, the message you are providing to your audience.
Thank you very much. Paul, George mentioned earlier about obviously the energy security issue in Ukraine and the original sin of the Ukrainian elite back in the 1990s. And I mean, obviously, energy security is part of your brief at the Helsinki Commission. Just wondering about whether you're concerned about whether Russia will be able to use its energy muscle in order to try and splinter the Western alliance in helping Ukraine and helping other countries against kleptocracy. You know, I think you could probably guess what country I'm thinking about here.
Well, absolutely, and in fact, this has been an area of really deep congressional engagement. And if this NDAA isn't powerful enough with all the AML provisions and beneficial ownership and everything else, it in fact includes further sanctions on Nord Stream 2. So, I mean, it has been a place where Congress has been heavily engaged. It is a very deep worry, and not just Nord Stream 2, of course, also Turk Stream, and there are other sort of concerns about the way that Russia uses its sort of its pipelines coercively. But yeah, I mean, it's the proof is in the pudding, and it's right there. And I think this is like the third time that Congress will be driving this issue forward. So, and I know that we're aligned with the State Department on this, and you know, it's been a strong reaction.
Well, that is all very good. We're drawing close to a close now. I suppose the interesting issue now to look at is the extent to which President Zelensky is on board. And I don't know whether anyone has any thoughts about this. Daria, could we start with you? Maybe do you think President Zelensky is on board with what we've been talking about? Is he on team reform? Do we think?
You know, it's very hard for me to answer this question because sometimes President Zelensky public promises, commitments, and messages do not correspond to his actions. Sometimes they do, but very often we see that they do not correspond. And you know, the most recent case was of one of the official in presidential office who is in charge for law enforcement reform being investigated by NABU. And once this investigation was revealed, the prosecutor general, who is very close to President Zelensky, just changed the prosecutors in the case to avoid issuing notice of suspicion to this official. And the same official is going public saying that NABU is a story of Western governments and we are losing sovereignty in Ukraine because of NABU. No, he's not saying that we are losing sovereignty in Ukraine because of Russia, which occupied Crimea and continues open military and hybrid attacks against Ukraine. But this official in the presidential administration is saying, oh, you know, they're probably the only agency which is independent in Ukraine from all law enforcement, that it is a Western story. So therefore, it's very contradictory feelings I have. But still, I believe that President Zelensky has a very powerful soft power potential. Because the way how he won the elections, the way how he is perceived across the region, and I'm also talking about Russia, is outstanding. So he is loved by households. He is loved because of his Servant of the People movie. It was Russian-speaking serial of his jokes and all his production, which he conducted. And through Servant of the People movie, he planted this idea from citizens, not only in Ukraine, but also outside of Ukraine, but Russian-speaking citizens, that the president from the people can serve the people. And if he will implement this idea as a real president, then it could be no return. And this soft power is so huge, I don't understand why he's not using it. And I also believe that our enemies understand this soft power. Therefore, it's not that, hard simply to attack Zelensky, but they want him to fail. And we now don't know actually who within his administration works for the interests of Ukraine and who works for the interest of enemy. I hope that President Zelensky himself works still for the interests of Ukraine.
Yes, I think we probably all think that, hope that. Anyway, I think that's probably enough from all of us. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And thank you, everyone, on Zoom and on Facebook and on YouTube and all the other channels. Happy Anti-Corruption Day. I hope next Anti-Corruption Day, not only will Paul's act be in law, and we will know, if not us, at least the FBI will know who owns all the American shell companies, but all the Ukrainian anti-corruption laws will be back in place. The EU will have stopped laundering money, and all the other wonderful things that would be nice to happen. So thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. Bye-bye.